This city is located in the southern part of the Anjano Empire and is called Faris. The town was established in the same year as the Royal Anjano Magic Academy. This place is famous for its magical powers. This is thanks to the Anjano Magic Academy, which was established more than 400 years after the empire was founded. Sistin and Rumia are students of this academy, and they are also close friends advancing together. While walking on the road, they encounter a young man named Glenn running toward them. Sistin quickly uses magic to make Glenn fly high and fall into the school's pond. The two of them tiptoe over, and Glenn emerges from the water without any embarrassment, confidently flicking his hair and greeting the two ladies while he's the one in a compromised position. Sistin and Rumia watch this scene with their mouths agape in astonishment, unable to speak a word. Not wanting to argue with him, they bow their heads and apologize to Glenn. He talks excessively, portraying himself as a bodhisattva, claiming that even though they were at fault, he graciously forgives them. Suddenly, Glenn leans in closely to observe Rumia, touching her inappropriately and saying she looks familiar, as if they've met before. Sistin watches this scene with irritation, causing her to use magic again to make Glenn fly high and fall on his rear into the pond before the two walk away. Meanwhile, Teacher Harley and Principal Rick are arguing about the substitute teacher who has no qualifications and unclear background and is only a third-rate professor. But the principal isn't too concerned about this because the person who recommended him is a professor, so there's nothing to worry about. Just as Harley is bad-mouthing Glenn, Celica appears, scaring him away. Celica and Principal Rick discuss Glenn. She is the one who recommended Glenn and promises to take full responsibility if he works here. On Glenn's side, he has arrived late to class, causing students to complain incessantly. Once in class, he doesn't even bother to teach, lazily writing self-study in large letters on the board. This infuriates Sistin, who punches him. Only then does Glenn agree to go to the board and teach. But his handwriting is like chicken scratches, and no one can understand it. After standing up to write for just a moment, Glenn looks lifeless, as if he might collapse on the spot. A student in the class raises his hand to ask about the magic language Glenn just taught. Glenn brushes it off, saying he doesn't know either. Sistin stands up again demanding justice, claiming he's not worthy to be a teacher. Only if tomorrow he explains to the students properly will he deserve to be called a teacher. Glenn calmly tells the students to research it themselves, which would be faster. Before he can finish his sentence, the bell rings. Glenn excitedly runs outside, announcing the end of the period, leaving the students bewildered. After class, the female students go to change their uniforms, while Sistin is still upset about the irresponsible teacher. Just as she says a few words, Glenn passes by and inappropriately touches Rumia's face, making all the girls around blush. At this moment, Glenn kicks the door open, complaining about the previous teaching period. Opening their eyes, both sides stare at each other in confusion. Glenn seems to have lost all sense of shame and comments on this extremely crude scene as if in a story. Why should a boy panic, turn away, and run from here? He must be asking for trouble for accidentally seeing girls' bodies. It's really not worth it at all, he says, and then opens his eyes wide to look again. The angry group kicks him out of the room. The two girls go to the dining hall, and Sistin is sad because the class's alchemy lesson was postponed while she wants to study properly, because her promise to her grandfather was to decode the mystery of Sky Castle. That's why she wants to learn more magic. While they're talking, Glenn shows up. With a plate full of food, he calmly eats as if nothing had happened, making Sistin red with anger. But she still forces herself to finish her plate. Unlike Sistin, Rumia chats comfortably with Glenn. She looks down at her plate and notices the stir-fried beans look quite delicious. He offers her a taste, and indeed it suits her palate. Glenn turns to look at Sistin's plate, worried that with so little of this cake dish, she won't be full, but Sistin turns away, refusing to look. She tells him he has no right to complain about her portion and adds that she will sleep during his class. But he seems to be an atheist with no emotional reaction to her words, while the students around are shocked. Glenn verbally says she can say whatever she wants, but when Sistin is about to open her mouth, he feeds her a spoonful of stir-fried beans to shut her up, and even eats her cake portion. Meanwhile, Celica is sitting on the school roof, thinking about the previous incident when she tried to persuade Glenn to be a substitute teacher at this school. He gave many reasons to refuse, but she insisted that Glenn teach. Regarding his status, Glenn truly isn't qualified to teach here, but Celica has seen through him. In the end, reason had to yield to power. Glenn was beaten up and had his wooden house pierced by Celica. Thinking about this, Celica can only shake her head in distress. After the break, it's time for the afternoon class. The rarely diligent Glenn is still as usual, telling all the students to self-study. The second period and then the third period still show the words self-study on the board, but the handwriting becomes increasingly lazy, scribbled like a child learning to write. Sistine is still the one who stands up for the collective. She angrily stands up and introduces herself as the daughter of the influential sorcerer Fibble, threatening Glenn that if he continues like this, she'll report to her father to have him fired. This is exactly what Glenn wants. He excitedly stands up, grabs Sistine's hand, and asks her to tell her father that he is very much looking forward to this. Sistine sees this as sarcasm. She trembles with anger, and this time, she makes a big move by taking off her gloves to challenge Glenn, leaving the whole class stunned. For a moment, Sistine's hair reminds him of the silhouette of a girl on the grassland. More surprisingly, Glenn doesn't refuse the condition. If Sistine wins, he must teach seriously. If he wins, she must tell her father to let him quit. So the whole class goes outside to watch the duel. The blue sky suddenly turns black. Glenn stipulates that only basic electrical magic can be used, and all other magic is forbidden. Everyone thinks that a teacher like Glenn will win, also because of his confident to the point of arrogant appearance. Sistine is determined to defend the honor of a future sorcerer. She makes the first move using Spirit Thunder Electric Shock. The opponent has made a move while Glenn hasn't even acted yet, shocking everyone who must think he will counter with something powerful. But Glenn sneers. He takes the full brunt of this attack and gets electrocuted to the point of stupidity. Everyone is surprised, and the black sky clears, returning to a brighter space. Seeing him lying on the ground, Sistine becomes confused, fearing she misunderstood the rules. Glenn admits he was wrong, reminding her that they're fighting a best of 3 when this wasn't established from the beginning. In the second round, Glenn eagerly makes a similar move, but Sistine's attack is still faster. He again claims it's wrong and makes it a best of 5, even trying to trick her into looking away to make his move. But he still can't move fast enough and gets electrocuted by Sistine until he's stiff. He then denies any agreement and runs away, to the frustration of his students. The next day, Glenn has improved and no longer arrives late to class. Yesterday, student Rin still wanted to ask him about magic, but Sistine went up to advise her friend not to ask because he doesn't know anything about the greatness of magic. Sistine even promised to teach her herself. Glenn remains calm as always, questioning whether magic really has such value. Sistine stops, confidently replying that magic is the truth of human research, and humans can discover an even nobler existence. She concludes it is valuable and great. Glenn asks what's the benefit of researching the world's truth. As soon as he finishes, Sistine loudly repeats that it's researching a more noble existence. Before she can finish, Glenn questions what is considered a more noble existence, leaving Sistine frozen stiff. For him, this question can be answered by saying it's the gods that are more important, and what use is magic to people. While all areas of life such as agriculture, industry, and healthcare help humanity, as do science and architecture. To Glenn, magic is a useless existence. Sistine refutes that it benefits humanity. Now Glenn stands up, remembering that magic is indeed useful for taking human lives. Magic is more effective than swords or guns in this regard. He presents a series of evidence, leaving the student speechless. Sistine seems to have reached her limit. She walks up and slaps him, bursts into tears, and runs out. In the afternoon, Glenn goes up to the roof to think about today's events. Remembering Sistine's face when she argued with him and cried, his hand touches his slapped cheek, and he admits to himself that he is indeed childish. Glenn doesn't think much more. He decides to leave this job. Just as he turns to go, he spots Rumia in the building across through the window, doing something with a magic array. While she's still studying the book, Glenn kicks the door open and enters, startling her. Rumia explains she just wants to review how to build a magic array. If not allowed, she'll clean up the place, but Glenn doesn't object and tells her to continue. So Rumia shows her failed result. Glenn explains it needs some mercury to activate. He gets mercury, pours it around the magic array, and has Rumia recite the spell again. Sure enough, this time it works. 7-colored light rises, fascinating Rumia as she stares intently. She has never seen such a beautiful magic array. The look in her eyes reminds Glenn of himself as a child seeing a magic array for the first time. Then the two of them leave together. On the way back, Rumia thinks that Glenn doesn't seem to hate magic as he said in class. Perhaps because of his expression earlier when he saw the magic array working, Rumia has this thought. The conversation extends as she becomes curious about Glenn's previous life. He says he's just a freeloader. Specifically, Glenn had been living off Celica for a year before deciding to teach at this school. As for what happened before that, he refuses to answer. Glenn just doesn't understand why his students seem overly enthusiastic about magic and revere it as something so great. Rumia explains her part, saying her goal is even greater. She wants magic to become useful to humanity. More importantly, she wants to repay the person who once saved her life. Glenn is silent for a moment, seeming somewhat interested in this. Rumia recounts this story from 3 years ago when she was expelled from home, around the time she began living with Sistin. Rumia had been captured by an evil sorcerer and almost died. Glenn gapes in astonishment upon hearing this, while Rumia continues to focus on telling the story from that year. At that time, a justice sorcerer came to save her. Rumia still remembers the scene of her sitting and observing the back of that sorcerer as he put each villain into the grave. It's because of this past event that she wants to understand more about magic. She wants to guide humanity so it doesn't get lost because of magic. Rumia steps in front of Glenn. She wants to meet that person again and say thank you. Soon it's evening, and they go home. Rumia reminds Glenn to apologize to Sistin because she used magic to connect with her deceased grandfather. Sistin, standing above, has heard everything Rumia said. She looks over at her bed. She remembers when she was young, hearing her grandfather's dream of stepping foot on the celestial city Melgalius, which was why he became a sorcerer. His beloved granddaughter Sistin held his hand, promising that she would become an even better sorcerer than him, and would decode the mystery of the celestial city Melgalius. Sistin's tears fall as this painful scene disappears. The next day, Glenn goes to class as usual. He bows deeply to apologize to Sistin in front of the whole class, shyly admitting he went a bit too far. Different from usual is that Glenn is now seriously teaching the students. Initially, everyone looks down on him because he's just a third-rate sorcerer who can't even shorten a simple spell like electric shock. Glenn surely wants to tell them they're too stupid. He decides to enlighten these fools about electric shock. The basics are divided into 3 currents. The question posed is what happens if changed to 4 currents. The answer, of course, is that the thunder spell won't operate correctly. But Glenn wants to know how it will fail. A once confident student who claimed to master the thunder spell states that dividing it into 4 currents will lead to random results. The final answer is that it will follow a curved path. Glenn proves this, astonishing the students present. If divided into 5 currents, it will shorten. If a part is removed, its power will be significantly reduced. All students attentively listen to Glenn's teaching. Out of nowhere, he goes to confess his love to Sistin, making her blush with embarrassment. To prove the power of words and their influence on a person, he shows the class Sistin as the most practical case. Sistin whimpers and throws a book at his head. This might be one of the rare occasions when Glenn gets angry, scolding her for being foolish. But Sistin doesn't give in and argues back. Quickly, everything returns to normal, and Glenn continues his lesson. He demonstrates with a casual thunder spell, but can still summon magic, amazing the students. After all, he can prove the uselessness of the textbook, claiming that memorizing, writing, or translating spells is unnecessary. Glenn calls it a lesson for fools, throws the book away, and continues his lecture. More and more students from other classes come to hear Glenn teach. Principal Rick and Celica are delighted to see him taking this seriously. Meanwhile, the evil forces begin to act, waiting for the magic conference to take place to execute their plan. The next day, Glenn runs frantically because he's late, but there's no one on campus. He immediately senses that evil forces have appeared. 2 figures emerge from their hidden dark magic veil. They have used a barrier to block people, and the blonde one uses magic on Glenn. At the student's location, everyone is complaining because he's late. Sistine is upset because lately, Glenn seems too popular, but Rumia beside her teases that she cares too much about him, which is why she feels that way. Before they can enjoy the moment much longer, 2 figures from the evil side come looking for Rumia. They take her away, saying they've dealt with Glenn, but no one believes them. It turns out Rumia's true identity is Princess Ermiana, according to the black-haired man. The blonde one takes Sistin to another empty room to play. Initially, she speaks loudly, appearing strong, but her psychological wall collapses when he touches her. She cries, begging him not to do this. Just at this critical moment, Glenn kicks the door open. He was about to leave, fearing he was interrupting the two. Only when Sistan loudly calls for help does he turn back. The blonde man uses magic, but it's ineffective because Glenn had previously used the Fool's World card. By charging energy into the card, he can seal any activation of magic around him. This also means that he himself can't use magic either. This battle can only be fought hand to hand. After just a few rounds, the blonde man abandons his dark intentions towards Sistan. Glenn had dealt with the blonde-haired man by making him temporarily freeze in place, and no one cared about him anymore. Glenn knew Sistan would have questions, so he stopped her before she could speak. Actually, he was wrong, because what Sistan wanted to say was that his pants were falling down. Glenn turned to the frozen blonde man. Through Sistan, he learned there were 2 more intruders in the school, and one of them had taken Rumia away. Looking at the tattoo on the blonde man's arm made Glenn recognize it with shock. He quickly contacted Celica in this urgent, life-threatening situation. He couldn't stay calm. Students had been taken hostage, and all exits of the academy were blocked. These 3 were researchers from the Tanachi Society, identifiable by the tattoo on the left arm of the frozen man. Celica was a bit surprised. They couldn't infiltrate without inside help. When Glenn requested reinforcements, it wasn't possible because Celica was currently only a professor. Hearing this, Glenn couldn't stay calm anymore and thought about the teleportation gate in the academy. But Celica explained that when they infiltrated, the teleportation gate would have been destroyed first. She also couldn't leave her speech at the conference to come to the academy, so she could only rely on Glenn. She even expressed hope that he wouldn't die. While Glenn and Sistan were arguing with the blonde member of the Tanachi Society, he summoned skeletal monsters emerging from a purple circle. One charged forward but misidentified its target, going to the blonde man, swinging its sword to kill him before turning to Glenn and Sistan. He pushed the white cat to run, but she didn't leave, staying behind. Sistan had used magic to help Glenn activate his own magic. He punched through one monster, and they both ran into the hallway. Glenn told Sistan to use Gil Glow with an extended and wider spreading incantation. She felt it wasn't easy. Glenn reassured her, saying if she remembered what he taught, it wouldn't be difficult at all. It took Sistan a moment to successfully figure it out, but she still couldn't completely stop these creatures. The rest depended on Glenn. He took out a red stone and used high-level magic to completely destroy these bizarre skeletons, also puncturing the wall behind them. Right after using this magic, Glenn collapsed to the ground, his entire body turning purple like a dried corpse. This was due to his magic deficiency from excessive use, causing Sistan to worriedly run to him. Glenn quickly regained his senses. Just as the 2 were about to run away, the second of the 3 intruders approached, with flying swords around him. Glenn quietly asked Sistan if she could still use Dispel Fox magic to neutralize those swords. She sadly recalled that even if she overused her remaining magic, it wouldn't be enough. As soon as she finished speaking, Glenn pushed her through the hole in the wall behind this scarred-faced man. Knowing he could nullify magic, the man had activated it from the beginning, making it unstoppable. And Glenn had also activated his own magic, but it was all dispersed by the scarred man. Glenn landed a hit, but the scarred man blocked it with magic energy. He counterattacked by stabbing swords into Glenn's body. While he was using incantations to activate magic, Sistan appeared just in time to help, causing the swords embedded in his body to turn to stone and fall off. Glenn took a sword and stabbed it straight into the scarred man. It turns out earlier he didn't simply want to save her, but also signaled for her to assist him when using magic. The 2 quickly set out to find the location of the 3rd man, but somehow collapsed along the way. When he woke up, Glenn received a communication from Celica that with the current barrier, no one could get out. Glenn suddenly remembered something. Through Celica, he knew the teleportation gate was at the highest tower of the academy. Glenn realized it wasn't destroyed, only its destination had been changed to allow the dark sorcerers to easily escape. So, leaving Sistan asleep alone in the hallway, he ran up to that tower. Indeed, the only remaining member of the society was there. He was Himari, who had captured Rumia. In the next 10 minutes, the teleportation gate would be fully reconstructed. That's when he and Rumia would leave this place. The white magic would automatically activate, and his soul would be absorbed to generate magic power. And that's when the academy would be destroyed. Glenn couldn't defeat this guy because if he died, the magic would automatically activate. To prevent the worst possible scenario, Glenn had to use his own blood to write a message, forcing the magic to stop. He broke through each layer of the white magic, but by the 4th layer, he was exhausted due to the previous battle with the scarred man. which had depleted too much of his magic power. It was Glenn's effort to get close to the final layer that allowed Rumia to reach through the barrier and transmit magic to him, healing his wounds. Finally, he broke through the 5th layer. The light at this moment echoed across the sky. Glenn had also defeated Himari, and when Sistan, who had seen the light, rushed up to the tower, he had already fallen asleep on Rumia's lap. Indeed, he was only missing a crown to be king. 2 close attendants of Queen Alicia came to inform her about the intrusion at the Anjano Magic Academy. After discussing ensuring the safety of the upcoming magic competition, Zelos left, leaving only the queen's handmaid. She was sad because her child had been separated from her for many years, as she had sent her away with the excuse that the princess had died in an accident. Although Alicia was very sad, she was content as long as her daughter Ermiana was happy. At the academy, Sistan and Rumia were announcing the upcoming magic competition, but no one wanted to participate for fear of losing. Despite their encouragement, no one wanted to volunteer to be a laughingstock in front of the queen. At this moment, Glenn kicked the door open, helping to assign all class members according to each person's strengths. Rumia realized that Glenn had always cared about his students, a dirty guy with a good side. The truth is, Glenn had previously tried to request food supplies from the principal, but was refused and had an argument with Celica. Nevertheless, he could still receive a special reward by winning the upcoming magic competition. This was the real leverage that made Glenn so enthusiastic with the students. Glenn's enthusiasm was commendable, but the students didn't want to participate. The majority thought they couldn't win, and a student named Gibbon spoke up to oppose Glenn. Other classes only selected outstanding students to participate, as was customary. He was even more pleased, thinking the student could compete in multiple events. But on Glenn's side, there were already Sistan and Rumia. Sistan responded to Gibbon on Glenn's behalf, saying this competition only had meaning when everyone participated with a spirit of unity. By the afternoon, Glenn finally realized that other classes only sent their outstanding students to participate. He stood above, looking through the window at students trying to activate magic. When 2 classes gathered to practice, they argued. Harley even felt that Glenn's class was allowing too many redundant elements to participate while his class only selected excellent students. That was the strongest lineup from his class. While arguing, Glenn got too excited and rashly bet 3 months' salary that his class would win. Although inwardly terrified, his manly pride wouldn't allow him to take back these words. Harley also thought a lot, ignoring even spending money on research. He also agreed to bet 3 months' salary with Glenn when he turned to look at his confident students. In this tense atmosphere, Sistan went up to remind the 2 that Harley had no right to occupy this training field. If he still refused to yield, she would report this matter to the academy leadership. Harley could only complain inwardly, not daring to say anything more to Glenn. And Sistan was determined to fight together with everyone until the end to achieve victory. Harley was bitter but ultimately had to leave with his students. As for Glenn, he was lazy. Even breathing made him tired. Yet now he had to train his students, so he could only slap his own face to stay more alert. During that week, he seriously trained the students. In the evening, when returning home, Rumia stood outside in the corridor, suddenly remembering herself as a child, abandoned in fire, facing a field of corpses. The little girl was afraid and about to scream when suddenly the silhouette of a man appeared, and that person said many things to her. While Rumia was recalling the past, Sistine called her down for dinner. The family ate together, and Sistine's father apologized for not being able to be present at their competition tomorrow because he was busy. But Sistine and Rumia understood the 2 adults, so they didn't complain. Sistine's father jumped up upon hearing this, turning to tell his wife Juliana how incredibly kind their 2 daughters were. In fact, they had long considered Rumia as their own daughter. Juliana gently hugged her husband tightly, making him quiet down. Queen Alicia was also on her way to the competition venue. The handmaid beside her noticed her unusually cheerful expression. Alicia was happy because she would soon see her child. Even if she could only watch from afar, she would be satisfied. She kept a photo of herself with her daughter in a necklace she always wore. At this point, the handmaid beside her took out another jade green necklace and advised the queen to wear this at tomorrow's magic contest to stand out. Arriving at the competition venue with spectators filling the stands, the participating classes gathered below the stage. At this point, the first flying race began, and the members of Class 2 won. Even Glenn, as the homeroom teacher, couldn't believe it, but he still boasted that he had calculated this based on the 2 young men's abilities long ago. Their abilities might not be impressive, But with this momentum, the students about to enter the field felt more confident. So, round by round, Glen's students claimed victory, while the queen above was still observing Rumia from a distance. The final round was the steadfastness test, and the person chosen to compete was Rumia. It didn't seem like a wise choice because she specialized in white healing magic, and other areas were questionable. This round included 6 contestants. The rules were simple. The one who could withstand the magic and stand firm until the end would win. With Professor Jess's challenge, the first magic was Sleep Shall. This round eliminated a member from Class 1. Jess, with his goat-like face, licked his staff, causing the witnessing students to give him looks of contempt. Next, he used his skilled tongue to chant spells, making the students turn pale, wanting to vomit. One by one, the students were defeated until only 2 remained. Even Gibbon, who had previously criticized Rumia, couldn't understand how she was so strong. In the final round, Rumia collapsed but still wanted to win with everyone, so she wouldn't allow herself to give up. At this point, Glen and Sistan went down, fearing she was overexerting herself and wanting to forfeit on her behalf. In the end, Rumia validly won because Real had fainted while standing, and she had already endured the mind break before. Witnessing the success and happiness on her daughter's face, the queen finally couldn't help but express some emotion. The competition was still ongoing, with Class 2 members continuously winning victories, changing their position from second to first place. Meanwhile, Glen looked like he was about to die because he still hadn't eaten anything. At the highest point of the arena, 2 royal sorcerers stood observing all movements. They immediately recognized their colleague, Glen. As Reiru started to step forward, Albert grabbed her ponytail and pulled her back. Although Albert wanted to find Glen, their current duty was to protect the queen's safety, so they couldn't neglect that. Observing the guards was their most important mission right now. Reiru didn't understand why they needed to be vigilant when Xenos' guard team was their ally. Albert explained they had received reports of suspicious behavior within the guard ranks. There was a possibility they might harm the queen, so they couldn't ignore even the slightest movement. Their superiors were worried this would happen. During lunch break, all students brought their sandwiches. Only Glen still had nothing to eat. He went outside, and Rin ran up to talk about the afternoon competition. She wanted to switch it to someone else. Rin explained she had practiced the shell illusion spell as best as she could, but still wasn't good enough. Glen encouraged her not to give up and to just view this as a festival without putting too much pressure on herself. But Rin still wanted to quit, so Glen had to teach her some transformation magic. He recited a spell and transformed into Rumia. Rin found it very magical, continuously admiring his current form. She also decided to continue participating in this battle. As soon as Rin left, Sistan approached. At this moment, Glen was still in Rumia's form, so he was mistaken for Rumia. Nevertheless, seeing the food that Sistan brought made Glen struggle psychologically. Although he tried to control his hunger, faced with this temptation, even a teacher's dignity had to yield. Just as he was about to pick up a sandwich to eat, the real Rumia ran over. Sistan, angry at feeling deceived, made him fly into the air and fall headfirst onto the ground in the forest. She was sad because this was a lunchbox she had made with her own hands, now ruined. Glen sadly returned to the academy, looking no different from a dried skeleton, only able to chew on a twig instead of food. Fortunately, his angel ran over Rumia with the lunchbox from earlier. His eyes lit up, seeing her as a divine being appearing in his life, whether due to hunger or not. Glen ate while repeatedly praising how delicious it was. Although he very much wanted to know who made it, Rumia kept it a secret. While they were talking, another person appeared asking about Glen's identity. Initially, he didn't even bother to look over, speaking very flippantly, but when he turned his head and saw the queen standing before him, Glen was terrified, quickly giving proper respects to her. Even Rumia was very surprised by her presence. Meanwhile, the guards were panicking because they couldn't find Her Majesty the Queen anywhere. Actually, Queen Celica came here because she wanted to humble herself and apologize to Glen for having dismissed a royal sorcerer. He quickly stood up and said it was just because he was tired of this job. Glen was confused about why the queen came here all alone. She didn't answer but turned to look at her daughter Rumia, while Rumia still looked at her in bewilderment. Perhaps the word mother was now too distant for Rumia. As for Alicia, she calmly stepped forward. Although they hadn't met for many years, she still acted like a normal mother beside her, asking various questions. Rumia was confused but quickly pulled back to reality, respectfully bowing to maintain distance from the queen and telling her she had mistaken her identity. Princess Ermiana, whom Alicia mentioned, should have died 3 years ago in an epidemic, she said, then ran away without looking back. How could someone who had been abandoned easily accept kind inquiries? Alicia knew this well, but because of Celica's so-called rare opportunity, she had mustered all her courage to come here. She said goodbye to Glenn and left. As soon as Alicia entered the gate, she was stopped by Xenos. He ordered the guards to arrest the queen. Through his magic, Albert could see this. He knew well that Xenos was a veteran warrior, commanding the guards to ensure the queen's safety. One thing was certain, he wouldn't harm the queen, but this would lead to some conspiracy. Meanwhile, the competition continued normally because no one knew what had happened. Representatives from Glenn's Class 2 won almost absolute victories in each round. This time, he didn't have the mood to observe anymore. In his heart, he was still thinking about Rumia and the queen, a princess abandoned by the royal family because of her superpower. While he was still concerned, Sistine approached without a sound. Glenn was still afraid she would blow him away again. But Sistine was worried about Rumia because she hadn't returned yet and wanted to ask him about Rumia's whereabouts. Glenn whispered into Sistine's ear, telling her about Rumia giving him the sandwich. Although she didn't make it herself, it was delicious. In Glenn's eyes, Rumia was an angel. He praised the sandwich endlessly. Hearing him speak, Sistine blushed with embarrassment. The identity-hidden sandwich was now known, but Glenn didn't realize it, feeling she was so strange until Sistine drove him away. Glenn had now found Rumia. She was sitting looking at the bracelet in her hand. Although there was no picture, Rumia knew why she was abandoned. She was a demon-creating object, a cursed thing with power, and because the superpower she possessed could harm the royal family's position. Understanding this was one thing, but saying she had no hatred would be a lie. Yet Rumia still wanted to run to the queen and hug her, calling her mother. Glenn sat down and advised her for a long time. In this situation, if emotions were used, even if the result wasn't as expected, she wouldn't feel regret. Glenn also told his own story when he was still a royal sorcerer. He advised her to face rather than try to escape reality. Although Rumia very much wanted to, she was still struggling psychologically, afraid that the queen would look at her with those cold, distant eyes. It didn't matter because Glenn volunteered to go with her. Just as they stood up, the guards came wanting to arrest Rumia, saying this was the queen's order because she had conspired to assassinate Queen Alicia Roman VII, and assassinating the noble queen was a capital offense. As soon as Glenn heard this, he knew it was a fraud, but Rumia believed it was true. She accepted going with them. They knocked Glenn unconscious for interfering, then tied Rumia to a tree, preparing for execution. She recalled earlier, so that's why the queen had come to see her one last time, hence the gentleness. 2 teardrops fell from her eyes. She closed them tightly regardless of their decision. Just as one raised his blade, a blinding light from the sky shone down. The soldiers all fainted. When Rumia opened her eyes, Glenn was standing before her. Rumia was worried this was treason, but Glenn was certain the queen would never hastily execute anyone without a trial. Then he carried her up to escape the pursuing guards. In a corner alley, he tried to contact Celica, but she couldn't explain the current situation because she was also being held captive with the queen, saying only that he alone could break the current chess game. Here, Glenn reunited with his 2 old colleagues. Even the head maid Elino was a spy. She told Celica that the jade green necklace the queen was wearing was a death curse, and before sunset, Princess Ermiana must be beheaded. At this moment, everyone was still focused on the competition. Meanwhile, Glenn still didn't know he had met his colleagues. Moreover, Riru had struck first. The two fought enthusiastically for a long time. Just when it came to the decisive move, Albert intervened to stop Riru. He came over to greet Glenn after many years. He was so angry that he had to punish Riru by rubbing her forehead hard for a while. Rumia saw everyone seemed close but didn't know who they were. Glenn introduced them briefly as his colleagues from the Imperial Army. The situation was now very critical. Albert told Glenn the guards were confining the queen. It seemed they were aiming to eliminate the former Princess Ermiana. Celica was still sitting in the VIP seats, but for now, she hadn't taken action. Glenn found it very strange that with Celica's strength, she could easily beat 2 guards but did nothing. Even stranger was why they only targeted Rumia now. That would be explained later, but now they had to break this difficult chess game first. Riru thought of a direct approach without much calculation, just the 3 of them advancing in sequence. As soon as she finished speaking, Glenn again rubbed her temples hard. Glenn hoped to receive help from the two of them. Previously, Celica had instructed him to find some way to reach the queen, but Albert knew nothing about her. Glenn explained she was the former executioner No. 21 of the Special World Force, Celica. Albert could only trust him, while Glenn bet on Celica because he knew she never gave unnecessary instructions. At the arena, Class 2 students were panicking because Glenn was nowhere to be found. At this moment, Albert and Riru came over, introducing themselves as Glenn's colleagues. Because he had an urgent matter that couldn't be postponed, he asked the two of them to lead Class 2. Glenn wanted to tell his students, "Please win." Riru went up, took a student's hand, and gave instructions, saying she must win. This action reminded them of someone. Hearing this, the other students couldn't believe the strangers. Only Sistan understood and advised everyone to remember Glenn's demeanor if they knew their class couldn't win. Glenn was famous for his extremely painful taunts, so the students' self-respect wouldn't allow them to give up. So, following Sistan, they all agreed to let these two lead their class. Glenn had been absent for a while, so during that time, the class's morale had dropped significantly. The defeats had become a streak. If they lost again, they would be crushed by Class 1. Next was the transformation test, with Rin representing Class 2, someone who had always lacked confidence in this area, although this was the magic she had always pursued. Albert seemed to know this in advance. He went over to comfort her just as Glenn had once done. Rin found it coincidental but didn't think too much about it, then stepped onto the arena. The opponent had transformed into a dragon with large, majestic wings. When it was Rin's turn, she transformed into a beautiful angel with a touching appearance. With that, she won this test. In the teamwork round, Class 2 also passed. In the final round, it was Sistan's turn to go to the arena. She used the magic that Glenn had taught her. The storm statue prevented the opponent from advancing or activating magic, and she used adjustment magic to throw the opponent out. According to the rules, Class 2 had won the deciding match and was the champion of this year's competition. The whole class rejoiced, jumping together. This year's champion would receive the award directly from Queen Alicia's hands. Albert and Riru went up to meet the queen. He gradually transformed into Glenn, while Riru transformed into Rumia. Meanwhile, on the other side, Glenn and Rumia transformed back into Albert and Riru, shocking everyone around. They had switched places using the shell illusion. Xenos angrily ordered the guards to capture the two of them, but Celica had already created a barrier. Only those involved could be here now. Glenn informed the queen that Xenos had falsely transmitted her orders to eliminate the former Princess Ermiana. Glenn wanted her to order the guards not to do that, but Xenos said no. After everything was over, he would take responsibility, but was determined to protect the queen for the sake of the Empire's life. At this point, the queen actually ordered Rumia's execution right now, but Glenn didn't believe it. He recalled her disappointed expression when Rumia didn't accept her as a mother. How could someone like that order the execution of her own child? Glenn was certain something wasn't right. Looking at the queen, he suddenly noticed something different about that green necklace. He asked about the necklace, and she picked it up, saying she liked it very much and didn't want to take it off at all. As soon as she finished speaking, Glenn understood the problem and turned to reassure Rumia that the queen still loved her very much. Then Glenn rushed to the queen but was blocked by Xenos. Although he missed, Glenn was still wounded on the arm. While the two were arguing, the queen had quickly taken off the necklace. The chain was thrown away and immediately shattered. Glenn understood their trick too well. He only needed to pay a little attention to know that the strange necklace had been cursed with a death spell. Whoever wore the necklace would carry that curse. If they took it off, the wearer would die. If too much time passed without fulfilling the condition of the curse, the owner of the necklace would also die. The only way to break the curse was to execute Rumia. Unfortunately, the curse was useless because Glenn was holding the Fool's World card, which could neutralize any magic around him. The queen no longer needed to deceive herself, so she went to embrace Rumia tightly. After years of separation, Rumia also hugged her and they both burst into tears. Meanwhile, Albert and Riru couldn't hold back Elino, allowing her to escape. Everything was over. The queen also said goodbye to Celica and returned to the palace. Glenn and Rumia went to a restaurant because he had promised his students he would treat them all if they won the championship. Anyway, he had 3 months' salary plus a bonus, so it was fine. The result was that the meal cost 1 million yen, wiping out his 3 months' salary and bonus completely. In a deserted forest, Sistine has her face against a tree and utters ambiguous words to teacher Glenn, saying she can't take it anymore, begging him to let her rest a bit, words that couldn't be interpreted innocently. But facing her pleading expression, teacher Glenn isn't moved at all. Like a true shut-in, he coldly rejects Sistine's request. Afterward, Glenn takes off his coat and gives it to Sistine, fearing she might catch a cold, then continues dragging her to practice hitting wooden stakes to improve her close combat skills. Unable to understand why she has to practice close combat when she's a long-range spellcaster, Sistine questions her teacher about what effect this exercise has on her strength. Hearing his student's question, Glenn doesn't falter. It seems he had anticipated she would ask this. So Glenn straightforwardly answers Sistine that sparring like this will sharpen her combat sense, and she will know when to attack and when to defend. Knowing Sistine has no interest in physical training, Glenn promises her that when her close combat abilities improve, he will teach her some super powerful military magic. Because military magic is very powerful, Sistine is somewhat apprehensive about its strength. But Glenn encourages his student, saying he believes in her abilities and in Sistine's judgment to not be controlled by magic. And when the time comes for power, military magic is truly necessary. The next morning, when Sistine and Rumia were on their way to the academy, they met their teacher Glenn with a haggard face. He probably partied too hard last night and was a bit sleep-deprived. Sistine thought Glenn was worried about his student Rumia, so he had intentionally waited here in advance. But Glenn told her not to think nonsense. The reason he appeared here was simply because it was on his way. As Glenn was preparing to turn and leave, a little girl appeared with a great sword in her hand. She quickly jumped up and delivered a fatal sword blow to Glenn. The teacher shouted in surprise, but fortunately, his training in the Western sword catching technique saved him from death by a hair's breadth, or the show would have ended right there. The girl was also an acquaintance of Glenn, and that deadly sword strike with killing intent was just a form of greeting. And that girl was Riru, sent by the imperial government to protect Rumia under the guise of a new transfer student at the academy. But this girl didn't want to protect Rumia at all, she only wanted to protect her teacher Glenn. Riru was led to class by the teacher, and her introduction almost revealed her identity as a royal guard. With Glenn's help, Riru completed her introduction to her classmates. Afterward, a student asked about the relationship between Riru and Glenn, seeing how close they appeared. As Glenn was unsure how to explain, Riru spoke up, saying Glenn was everything to her and she had decided to live her whole life for him. This bold and somewhat domineering declaration crushed the dreams of the young men in the class. The classroom was in an uproar and the teacher didn't know what to do, so he took the whole class to the practice field to train in long-range magic. At the practice field, Sistine, with her magical talent, skillfully used long-range spells to defeat the training dummy easily. When it was Riru's turn, she unleashed a series of long-range magic, but none hit the target. It seemed Riru's aiming ability was somewhat flawed, feeling that no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't hit the target. Riru asked Glenn if she could use any magic as long as it hit the target. After getting Glenn's confirmation, she used her specialty magic to summon a great sword. Then Riru grabbed her great sword without hesitation, treating the massive weapon like a throwing dart and tossed it. Surprisingly, this throw was perfectly accurate, completely destroying the dummy before the astonishment of everyone present. The next day, Glenn's class had a field trip. Without hesitation, teacher Glenn immediately chose the purpose of the excursion: to visit the Alchemy Research Institute on an island. At first, the male students in the class complained about the place they were going to visit because it had nothing interesting besides sun and water. But after teacher Glenn enlightened them about the goodness of the Alchemy Institute, explaining that the institute was on an island in the ocean, but had hot weather year-round, the boys could expect not only the sea but also cool bikinis, and the female students in the class were also of high quality. Hearing this, the boys' minds were no longer filled with complaints, but only with refreshing and abstract images. When he just arrived at the dock, Glenn met Albert. At this point, the protagonist knew that Albert was Rumia's true guard on this trip, and Ryoru was just bait. Albert warned Glenn to be cautious of Ryoru because she was truly very dangerous. After saying this, Albert left, leaving Glenn to think for himself. Although Glenn suffered from severe seasickness when taking the boat to the Alchemy Research Institute, as long as he thought about the scene of a long beach with colorful bikinis, even if it were war, he would have to try, let alone these few boats. Finally, what had to come did come when 3 girls came to invite Glenn to play beach volleyball. This teacher said he was afraid his fair skin would get sunburnt, but just 5 seconds later, he was shouting on the volleyball court, cheering everyone on. So everyone played until evening. The main event of tonight was sneaking into the girls' rooms. The male students had planned very carefully but didn't account for having a perverted teacher. So Glenn caught their infiltration plan. Seeing their plan foiled, the male students turned anger into action and moved against their teacher. Thus, a battle among men broke out. After defeating all the male students, Glenn went to the beach to enjoy the night scenery. There, he saw the 3 girls Rumia, Sistine, and Ryoru playing in the sea, and this scene before him was truly beautiful. Late at night, as Glenn was preparing to return to his room, he encountered Ryoru. She unexpectedly asked him why he left the Royal Sorcerer team, and without Glenn there, Ryoru seemed to have lost her purpose in life. Glenn didn't know how to explain, but Ryoru thought that Sistine and Rumia had stolen Glenn from her. After saying this, she turned and ran away. The next morning, the class had to walk to reach that research institute. On the way, Ryoru accidentally tripped and fell. Seeing their friend fall, Sistine and Rumia ran over to check on her, but were met with indifference and poisonous words from Ryoru. Because in Ryoru's mind now, she only thought that these 2 vixens before her had stolen her teacher Glenn. Glenn came from behind to explain to Rumia that he had said some hurtful words to Ryoru, so her mood was a bit unstable. He hoped everyone wouldn't take it to heart and would forgive Ryoru. After a long, tiring journey, the class finally reached the research institute they planned to visit. After meeting and shaking hands with the director, they all began to tour around the research institute. According to the bald director's introduction, this research institute combined alchemy and white magic, so it was called Platinum Magic. This place mainly researched pre-processed chimera creatures. While standing in front of the bizarre animals in this institute, Rumia lamented whether she would lose control and become evil if she delved deeply into this field. Hearing her best friend express her thoughts, Sistine also gave her opinion that if she didn't like researching this, she could research something else. For example, resurrecting the dead. Because previously, the Empire had launched a major project to research this. When she was about to explain this project in more detail to her friend, the bald director appeared from somewhere and talked about that project. In fact, that project had reached a dead end because the so-called resurrection of the dead was not promising. To meet all the requirements for resurrecting a dead person, one needed a gene code, the genetic code of the person to be resurrected to create a body through alchemy. Moreover, an astro code, the person's memories, was needed. And finally, antir etter, something that creates or reconstructs the human soul. Only when these 3 conditions were met could one create a simulated human. In the end, the Empire also stopped that absurd project because to resurrect one person, many others had to be sacrificed. By the evening, when the tour ended, the class invited each other to eat at a restaurant. Rumia saw Ryoru still sitting alone, looking sad, which made her feel unhappy. Seeing this, she went to chat with Ryoru and invited her to the restaurant. Ignoring the invitation from her friend Sistine, Ryoru stood up and left. At this moment, Glenn stepped forward, intending to advise Ryoru, but unexpectedly, her emotions were disturbed. She pushed Glenn's hand away and ran off with her head down. She ran all the way to the beach and cried, thinking that Glenn had left her because of those others. After explaining to Rumia and Sistine, Glenn also took action. As a teacher, he believed he had the responsibility to find and bring Ryoru back, not letting her think wildly anymore. At the same time, while Ryoru was still crying by the beach, someone suddenly appeared from behind. Surprisingly, this person was Ryuru's deceased brother, Nick. Albert, observing through magic from the forest, had seen this scene and knew that the other side's plan had begun to take action. Albert turned to leave but unexpectedly was trapped by a magic circle. Knowing he had been ambushed, Albert remained extremely calm because he knew the magic caster wasn't far from him. And then, from behind Albert, a woman in maid attire stepped out with a terrifying, shrill laugh. She was Elino Charlotte. While she was still inviting Albert, he had already launched a surprising magic attack towards her. Unexpectedly, she quickly dodged, and both, without any extra words, cast their specialty magic towards their opponent. A tremendous explosion occurred where the two fought. It seemed Albert's strength was slightly better than Elino's, as after that explosion, she was tattered like a torn blanket. Seeing she couldn't match his special attack, Elino summoned some undead creatures to surround and attack Albert. Who would have thought Albert was unbelievably strong, as the undead creatures hadn't even done anything before being destroyed by Albert's summoned lightning. Faced with Albert's superior strength, Elino showed no fear, because she had an extremely perverted healing ability. Recognizing Elino's super regeneration ability, Albert was somewhat surprised because this perversion didn't come from healing magic, nor from recovery medicine. This recovery ability came from something much more disgusting. Sensing the danger from the woman before him, Albert changed from his initial intention of capturing her alive to eliminating her to prevent future troubles. Meanwhile, on Ryuru's side, Brother Nick was implanting some negative ideas into her head. He used their sibling affection to tell her to eliminate Glenn and Rumia because only when she accomplished this would the organization agree to set him free. At that moment, Glenn had run over to stop this indoctrination process by the other person. Glenn told Ryryu that he wasn't her brother Nick, but just a dark sorcerer who had used the method of resurrecting the dead to create a clone resembling her brother. While Glenn was fired up with energy to fight against darkness, preparing to act together with Ryryu to eliminate the person before them, a surprise occurred. Without realizing when, Ryryu had summoned her great sword and pierced through Glenn's body. At this moment, Ryuru's eyes were soulless as she pulled her great sword out of Glenn's body, causing him to fall face down on the beach. After killing Glenn, Ryryu had run to Rumia's room to capture her for the Tenachi organization. When Sistin returned from the supermarket, she was confronted with the sight of blood all over Ryryu, while Rumia lay on the floor. Panicked by this scene, Ryryu then informed Sistin that she was a member of Tenachi. She had already killed Teacher Glenn, and Ryryu was here to take Rumia back to the organization, not to kill her. Hearing this, Sistin was ready to cast her magic to stop Ryuru's actions, but Ryryu stood still, allowing her to act. Yet Sistin's weakness and cowardice were revealed at this moment. Out of fear, she couldn't bring herself to act against the person before her, and could only watch as Ryryu carried Rumia away from the room. Right after, Albert carried Glenn back because he was only severely injured, not completely dead. Now Glenn's condition was extremely critical, even healing magic couldn't do anything. So Albert brought him here to seek Sistin's help. He needed to perform a white magic ritual called Reviver to save Glenn's life. Because this ritual required a lot of magic power, Albert sought Sistin's help. He needed to use the magic power of both of them to perform this ritual. When Rumia woke up, she was hanging from some sort of altar, which terrified her, and standing before her was her close friend Ryryu. Rumia asked Ryryu why she was doing this, to which she only replied that she didn't really want to. But if she didn't, she wouldn't know what her purpose in life was anymore. At the same time, Teacher Glenn was being pulled back from death by Albert and Sistin. Glenn was extremely touched, thinking he owed Albert a great deal. But when Albert explained that it was thanks to Sistin's enormous magic power that they could complete the Reviver ritual, and without her, Albert couldn't have done anything. Hearing this, Glenn was somewhat moved and surprised that his own student had helped so much. After fully waking up, Glenn was informed by Albert about the details of their superior's plan. Everything was to lure the Tenachi out to capture them. For this plan to succeed, Albert's superiors had used Rumia as bait, though in reality, Albert already knew all the intelligence. The Tenachi had connections with the bald director of the White Magic Research Institute. His ambition was to complete the project of resurrecting the dead, which the Empire had abandoned long ago. After formulating a rescue plan, Albert informed Glenn that his main purpose was to rescue Rumia. He would deal harshly with anyone interfering in this matter, even Ryru. But Glenn didn't agree with this decision because, as a teacher, he needed to awaken his student so that Ryru wouldn't go astray. So Albert gave Glenn a gun, and the two set off to rescue Rumia and bring Ryru home. Before the bald director began performing the resurrection of the dead, like all villains, he had to eloquently express his grievances about the royal family. But at this moment, the maid spoke up to end that opening monologue and get straight to the main business. But just then, she discovered that Albert had placed a tracking spell on her, and the Tanachi organization learned that Glenn and Albert were approaching their hideout. Not allowing these two to be at peace, the bald man sent a winged lion with 4 eyes to intercept the 2 young men. Who would have thought that young Albert was too powerful? Without a wasted word, he cast a fire spell on the lion in front of him, causing it to perish before it could show anything. After going a bit further, the 2 men encountered the next monster. This time, it was a bright green turtle with a bunch of sharp spines on its shell. This turtle seemed a bit stronger than the lion earlier. The bald man monitoring the situation laughed heartily, thinking his favorite beast could stop Glenn and Albert. But after dodging the turtle's attack, Glenn began to chant. When he completed his spell, Glenn delivered a fatal blow to the green turtle, causing the bald man to stop laughing and stare in disbelief. Angered because his pets were continuously defeated, the bald director had to personally intervene to stop the 2 young men advancing. Finally, Albert and Glenn confronted the bald director, but surprisingly, he had transformed himself into a monster, neither human nor beast. Seeing his disgusting appearance, Albert decided to confront him so Glenn could continue forward. After a skillful combination, Glenn managed to slip behind that monster to continue rescuing Rumia, while Albert stayed to solo fight him. When the process for the resurrection of the dead was nearly complete, Glenn arrived. At this moment, he had to face Nick and Ryru. When Glenn was about to charge forward to beat Nick, Ryru stood in the way to stop him. Glenn was extremely frustrated with this short-brained girl because her brother Nick had died 2 years ago. What stood before Ryru now was just an alchemical model. But Ryru wouldn't listen to Glenn's explanation, so she summoned her great sword and immediately engaged in battle with Glenn. Glenn couldn't attack Ryru because, after all, she was his student, so Glenn could only dodge all of Ryuru's attacks. But at this moment, Rumia, who was hanging above, began to recall all the joys and sorrows Ryuru had experienced recently, causing Ryuru to feel somewhat moved. Seeing that Ryuru's situation wasn't very stable, Glenn took out the gun from his person, aimed it at Ryuru, and fired, causing her to continuously step back. At this moment, Glenn said that if Ryuru could say her brother's name, he would immediately withdraw. But it seemed Ryuru couldn't say the name of her deceased brother. When she was trying to remember, a headache struck, causing Ryuru to collapse to the ground. Glenn had been waiting for this opportunity. He pretended to cast a spell, but actually placed his gun against Ryuru's head. Then Glenn rushed forward and hit Ryuru's head with his own head. This loving headbutt caused Ryuru to begin remembering the past, remembering everything about her deceased brother. The truth was that Ryuru was a product of the Resurrection Project, and her brother was the one who created her. That brother's name was Shen. In the past, Shen had used the Astro Code of Illusia, a close friend whom Shen valued, to create Ryuru. But who would have thought that when the project was almost successful, he was betrayed by a teammate. That teammate had killed Shen along with Illusia to monopolize the achievement. As for Ryuru, she was rescued by Glenn just in time. When Nick saw that Ryuru had regained her reason, he didn't bother pretending anymore. He immediately sent 3 clones of Ryuru to eliminate Glenn and her. The difference between these clones and Ryuru was that they had no reason. The 3 clones only acted according to commands like puppets, advancing towards Ryuru to eliminate her. At this moment, Glenn had run over to intervene just in time, saving Ryuru's life. She asked why Glenn would save a clone like herself, but he said that these 3 were the clones. Ryuru was just a bit short-brained, but she still had reason, so she wasn't a clone. Therefore, no matter what happened, she should live according to what she wanted, as all her friends and Glenn didn't see her as a clone. This statement awakened the potential deep within Ryuru, and then she once again stood up, grabbed her sword, and unleashed a great slaughter to eliminate those clones. At this moment, Glenn was free, so he went in front of Nick and aimed the gun at his head. Only now did Nick begin to panic, begging to be spared. But Glenn didn't bother listening to such nonsense pleas. when Nick had accepted closing his eyes to receive his death. Glenn surprised him even more by not shooting him, but delivering a thunderous punch to his face and warning him not to lay a hand on his students. Outside, Albert was preparing to execute the bald monster. The bald man, after transforming into a monster, looked imposing but couldn't actually do anything except stand still while Albert burned him bit by bit. Finally, Glenn and Albert successfully rescued Rumia and brought Reiru back safely. And now, peaceful life had returned to this group of teachers and students. Perhaps this scene was the image Glenn wanted to protect forever. The two men chatted while watching the students play beach volleyball, to the extent that Glenn had to exclaim that bikinis were still the best. Suddenly, a ball flew from there to where he was, and Sistan also ran over, waving at Glenn, asking the teacher to pick up the ball for her. Seeing her smiling brightly while playing volleyball, even Albert had to nod repeatedly, saying Sistan was like Sarah Silver. Meanwhile, the scheming villainess stood amid a pile of stone pillars, discussing with some hidden master about resurrecting Princess Ermiana. That person even released a cloud of red dust and sent the scheming woman to deal with everyone in the organization. That night, the three ate at Sistan's house, and her parents were so enthusiastic, constantly offering the dishes laid out on the table. Meanwhile, Reiru could only remain silent and nod, so Sistine had to speak up for this shy girl. Thanks to this, the enthusiastic parents could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Before they could exchange more than a few words, the father beside them continued to urge them to eat, causing even his daughter to feel helpless. At this moment, the mother announced that both parents had to go to the royal capital the next day, so the sisters should take care of each other. After dinner, all three went to the balcony to look at the stars, and Reiru suddenly apologized for recent incidents. But Sistine and Rumia didn't mind at all and hugged her tightly. The next morning, while getting books in the library, Sistine encountered Professor Celica. When the professor asked about Grandfather Fiben, she learned that Sistine was doing what her grandfather had always wanted, but she was hesitant, not knowing if she could do it. So Celica gave her advice. Those who always try to do something are fools who only move forward, while those who don't achieve anything are wise people who continue to advance. After that, she left an encouraging word and proudly walked away. After leaving Sistine there, Celica went down to the underground labyrinth. While putting a book on the shelf, Glenn suddenly appeared in front of Sistine, startling her. By the way, he wanted to thank her for saving him when he was injured. Who would have thought this would remind Sistine of giving her first kiss to him? So, unconsciously, Sistine's face turned red like a tomato. Just as Sistine was covering her face, Rumia and Reiru approached. Reiru thought Glenn had made her sister-in-arms cry, so she immediately drew her enormous sword and chased Glenn out to the street. Glenn was thus flung outside and encountered a horse carriage charging straight at him. He thought he was done for, but surprisingly, a handsome young man inside the carriage used wind magic to lift Glenn up. When getting off the carriage, he spotted Sistine and immediately went over to her with a friendly greeting. While Sistine was greeting this relative, Glenn interrupted, and only now did the young man introduce himself as Leo, invited to this academy as a guest and also Sistine's fiancé. Hearing this, everyone was shocked and cried out at this unexpected truth. Not only were they dumbfounded, but even Sistine was equally startled. It turned out this was a promise made by their parents long ago. Glenn also interjected with the eloquent reasoning that sticking with Sistine was like digging one's own grave. After saying this, Leo also charged forward, accusing Glenn of insulting his future wife. As soon as Sistine mentioned Glenn, Leo recognized him immediately because he was too famous at this academy. Glenn was also very happy that there was someone who could endure Sistine's temperament. As he spoke, he also teased her, causing Sistine's anger to flare up and cast a spell to send Glenn flying into the sky. In the first lesson, Leo taught in such a wonderful way that every student understood the lesson. Even difficult theories became easy to understand. Even Glenn had to acknowledge this. While lost in thought, Leo approached Sistine, inviting her for a walk outside to say something that seemed extremely important. It turned out his purpose was to confess and hope she would marry him. Unexpectedly, Glenn, Rumia, and Reiru were hiding in the bushes, eavesdropping on this couple. The reason was that Rumia felt something wasn't quite right, so they had to do this. Finally, Leo's proposal was flatly rejected by Sistine, because she had to follow her grandfather's wish to solve the mystery of the Sky Castle, and to do that, she needed to study more. After listening, Leo laughed because he thought it was extremely irrational and delusional. Because magical archaeology aimed to tear down the veil of mystery of ancient civilizations and recreate ancient magic. but no one had been able to do that yet. And if Sisten's grandfather hadn't focused on that, he could have achieved many great accomplishments in the history of magic. He talked on, but his true purpose was to invite her to join military magic research with him. Faced with such a tempting invitation, Sisten immediately refused because she had her own dream and would persistently pursue it until she achieved what she wanted. She spoke with her face reddening, and tears welled up in her eyes. At this moment, Glenn burst out from the bushes, pointing straight at Leo's face and demanding that he stop talking nonsense. He also encouraged Sisten, reminding her she was the protagonist of her own life. Leo was extremely displeased because the troublesome teacher Glenn kept coming to find him and causing trouble. Even though this wasn't his business, yet he kept interfering. But Sisten's will had returned and was stronger than before. She replied straight to Leo's face that Glenn and she were lovers who had sworn to spend their lives together. After hearing this, even Glenn was shocked and surprised, not to mention her nominal future husband. But Glenn's confusion lasted only a few seconds before he ran to Sisten's side to act out the scene with her. He admitted that he and Sisten indeed had that kind of relationship. Leo was dumbfounded, not believing his eyes, and shouted that Sisten would never fall for the crude Glenn. Glenn wasn't to be outdone and immediately retorted that he and Sisten had slept together last night. She blushed with embarrassment upon hearing this and once again cast a spell to send her teacher flying into the sky. In her panic, she even revealed that they had only kissed and nothing more. Later, Glenn appeared beside Sisten and, without hesitation, challenged Leo to a duel. He immediately accepted this challenge and left. After Leo left, Glenn boasted that if Sisten really became his wife, he wouldn't need to work and would still have money to spend. During the teaching period, Glenn announced to the whole class that there would be a magic training session to celebrate his upcoming marriage to Sisten, ignoring the students' apparent disapproval. That night, Albert cursed Glenn as scum for foolishly diving into a relationship with someone who didn't love him. But Glenn didn't care. Albert announced that angel dust had been smuggled into this city. Glenn was surprised, saying that the method of making that drug had been destroyed in last year's incident, and infected people could be controlled. At this point, Albert self-mockingly wondered what Sarah had died for. He remembered how she and he had flirted with each other, and he had promised to protect her. In a section of the street, Leo was sitting in a horse carriage, talking to a man with dark eyes, saying everything was according to plan because Glenn had challenged Leo. At all costs, he had to defeat Glenn. It seemed they were plotting something extremely terrible. Students from all classes gathered in neat rows to hear the announcement about the rules of this match. Whichever side captured the enemy base or defeated the opponent's commander would win. As soon as Glenn heard this, he applauded in approval. But Harley felt it was inappropriate, saying that using students from this noble school just to compete for a girl made him feel helpless. Harley was on Leo's side. He was the homeroom teacher of Class 4 and Glenn's opponent in this battle. Leo walked over and took Sisten's hand affectionately, promising he would definitely win so she could become his bride. Glenn instructed his students that they must win so he could get this money mine. The students looked at him in shock, feeling that not participating might be better for their friend. A classmate asked if Sisten would really marry the winner. Sistine appeared reluctant, saying she was still at the age for studying, but in her heart, she wondered if Glenn was serious. She even imagined him defeating Leo and coming to propose to her with a diamond ring. This romantic scene made Sisten blush. She shouted at herself loudly, and only Rumia understood what her friend was thinking. The final battle finally began. The large field was now more spacious, and Class 2 had made their move. First, several students at the back hadn't even had time to do anything before being attacked by Class 4. The first two were eliminated. Class 4 now looked very spirited, their magic far surpassing Class 2. They began to deploy the trio formation in magic. Leo's battle team stood from afar, observing their students. He was very confident because he had previously taught his students about important tactics in modern magic battles. In this area, Glenn had also taught his students to return to the current battle in this teamwork round. All teachers felt Class 4 had great potential, while Class 2 lacked consistency. They even said Glenn didn't focus on tactics in magic battles, but Harley had different thoughts. Leo was indeed an experienced person, a military magic researcher, but when the opponent was Glenn, it was hard to say. The students competed at close range, one by one revealing their magic. Although at a slight disadvantage, Class 2 could still hold on. The students from Class 4 hadn't expected that despite having an advantage in attack power, they couldn't overcome Class 2. Gibbon confidently felt this was natural because Glenn had taught them shorter incantations that could cast stronger spells, not to mention they had practiced very hard for many days, casting spells with the magic they were taught. It seemed victory was overwhelming Class 4, making all the teachers present amazed at this scene. Harley had to admit that Class 2's tactics were less complex, making it easier for students to perform with limited training time. A teacher beside him felt this was an action that blasphemed the Academy's long history. Harley wasn't unfamiliar with Glenn's character because he would do anything to win. That was who he was. On the other side, Leo stood high, communicating with his students, but they were at a disadvantage even though Class 2 only had Ryu left. But she was the final boss. An entire class couldn't fight against this kid. Even Leo hadn't expected Glenn to possess such a strong chess piece. Glenn stood on this side, taunting the students of Class 4, and they all chased after him. According to the competition rules, just defeating the commander could secure victory. The opportunity was right in front of them. Who would want to miss it? A student used thunder magic to attack, but was avoided by Glenn. He ran while luring these young bulls into his trap. Some fell into slime and then into pits. Others got caught in nets and were hung from trees. Glenn laughed triumphantly. His two students could only shake their heads in resignation. When Leo communicated again, the person holding that ring was Glenn. He immediately guessed it was because Glenn had set traps in advance. Sistin had just driven away several students from the opposing class. She hadn't expected him to use such dirty tactics to win. In her heart, she had imagined him seriously kneeling with a ring to propose to her. Now, seeing him standing and laughing like that made her scold herself for being a fool. In the end, the match was a tie, leaving the students from Glenn's class too extremely disappointed. He appeared to reassure them that what they had achieved was already something to be happy about. The students felt a bit of joy, but one of them recalled that the prize for the match wasn't Sistin. If so, had they missed the most precious prize? Unlike Glenn's side, Class 4 was scolded harshly by Leo after this match. Everyone was unhappy and felt pressured by the commander's ambition. Glenn passed by, taunting that wasn't the failure due to the commander's fault. Leo wasn't to be outdone and retorted with a few counters, then proposed a one-on-one battle with Glenn the next day. Both had their own ideals. Leo still maintained that affectionate appearance, while Glenn didn't want to give up marrying his money mine. Sistin came over and scolded both of them, saying she wasn't an object to be placed wherever they wanted. Sistin was especially displeased with Glenn's cowardly way of fighting, but he didn't care about what she said. He accepted Leo's challenge to solo duel. Sistin even slapped him hard for his disrespectful words, viewing her as a money mine, then ran away. Glenn remained calm, telling his students that today's practice had ended. On the way back in the carriage, Sistin sat chatting with Rumia. She was very angry about Glenn's way of calling her a money mine. But Rumia understood his character. He wasn't someone who only cared about money. Hearing this from her, Sistin recalled memories of Glenn. Indeed, he was always there whenever she needed him, the kind of man anyone would be moved by upon meeting. But Sistin still couldn't understand why Glenn accepted Leo's challenge. Rumia remembered the time when Leo had mocked Sistin's dream. Although Glenn was silent, his frown and uncomfortable gaze, and the time he dealt with Leo, made her understand. Though she couldn't express it clearly, Rumia was certain Glenn had his own reasons. Rumia didn't want to see Sistin hate Glenn like this. Thanks to these words, Sistin became more open-hearted. The next thing Rumia had to do was talk with Glenn. The truth was that Leo wanted to marry Sistin not for love, but for power. If they became a couple, thanks to Sistin's family background, he could consolidate the position of clan leader that was about to be inherited, and the Kleos clan would have an advantage over the other branch families. In the evening, while Glenn was contemplating some matters, Sistin came to question him about why he had challenged Leo, and also who was Sarah, the name he had just mentioned. Glenn still stubbornly said he wanted to marry the money mine. It was a rare opportunity. Without having to work, he should take advantage of it. And he told Sistin she was very similar to Sarah. He talked about how previously, he had carried the aspiration to become a righteous sorcerer, studying diligently, and then becoming a royal sorcerer. But then he awoke from his dream due to the limitations of magic and a bloody reality. Glenn had come to hate the magic he once loved dearly. Nevertheless, he still didn't give up his dream because he always had a friend who supported him unconditionally. During a mission, that friend of Glenn's had lost his life, causing him immense regret. Everything afterward became worse. He began to hate everything. Glenn abandoned his dream and became an unemployed hikikomori. And the reason why Glenn accepted the challenge was because Leo had mocked Sisten's dream. He wanted to see how that guy would cry miserably. Sistin felt he was very childish, doing silly things just because of personal emotions. The two chatted for a while before Leo approached. He thought Glenn was trying to use his pitiful past story to gain sympathy and wanted to tell Glenn's past for him. Glenn angrily warned him, but it didn't make Leo shut up. So the two had a duel. Glenn brought out the Fool's World cards so Leo couldn't use magic, then rushed into hand-to-hand combat with him. But somehow, Leo could still use magic. He summoned puppets and ordered them to attack Glenn. Due to being outnumbered, the teacher was beaten severely. Glenn collapsed to the floor, but he quickly regained consciousness and left. After Glenn left, Leo's true face was finally revealed. He knew well that Sistin didn't have feelings for him, so he could only use the most despicable method to achieve his goal, threatening to expose the true nature of Rumia's power to force her to agree to marry him. Contrary to Leo's usually affectionate appearance, he was like a completely different person, with a frightening gaze that sent chills down her spine. The next morning, all the classmates had heard the news about accepting Leo's marriage proposal, and everyone was very surprised. The official wedding would be held next week, so sudden that it seemed a bit strange. Only Gibbon felt this was normal. However, he was disappointed that Glenn hadn't appeared in the duel. As soon as she saw Sistin coming to class, her friend ran over to ask about the situation. It seemed unbelievable that Sistin had accepted Leo. What about that dream of becoming a witch? Sistin looked sad, unlike her usual self, but she still forced a smile and gave a perfunctory answer. The other friend looked at Rumia, wondering how she could accept this sudden event happening to her best friend. Rumia was still stammering with her answer when Leo appeared, taking Sistin away. Rieru wanted to chase after him and cut him with a sword, but Rumia stopped her. Rumia believed Glenn would definitely take action, but Rieru was very disappointed. It seemed she couldn't believe in him because it had been several days without seeing Glenn anywhere. Rieru was convinced he wouldn't return. She had previously sought out Sistin, but Sistin didn't say anything, only insisting she wanted to marry Leo. She then went to Glenn to tell him about the current situation. Glenn patted Rumia's head, promising to resolve this matter satisfactorily. He had already arranged everything before disappearing, so she firmly believed Glenn's disappearance definitely had its own reason. What they needed to do now was sit and wait for Glenn to take action. On the day of the wedding, Sistin walked in wearing a pure white bridal gown. Although it was a joyous day, no one could smile. Then Sistin was led to the altar. The groom and bride stood together, listening to the priest read the vows. On the bride's row, all the guests were present. Looking at the groom's side, there wasn't a single soul attending. Just as the two were preparing to vow to live together for life, Glenn appeared at the altar, making all the students happy with his presence. Glenn released a ball of black smoke, then handed Rumia to Rieru for protection, while he carried Sistin out. From before, Glenn had known Leo used Rumia to force her to agree to marry him. Sistin burst into tears, not knowing where he had been during all that time. Actually, after hearing Rumia explain the current situation, he had spent a lot of time calculating. He had prepared the necessary weapons, but Glenn still couldn't understand why Leo had acted like that. Was it because he loved Sistin too much? Since that night, she had realized he was like a completely different person, feeling certain that Leo was forcing her not out of love. Glenn didn't ask further. This was enough, and in his heart, he already knew what was happening. Angel dust creatures approached. They were like upgraded zombies because these monsters were acting according to their master's command, and they even went up to the altar. Just in time, 3 royal sorcerers appeared to protect the students as they fled. On Glenn's side, he had to both protect Sistin's safety and eliminate the angel dust. With Sistin's strength, she completely lacked the ability to destroy these creatures. She stood in a daze for a moment, witnessing Glenn eliminate the angel dust. The two of them ran into a dark alley with no visible way out. Glenn grabbed Sistin's hand as they went together. The further they ran, the more it reminded him of feelings from the past. He had also fought with angel dust before, but ultimately couldn't save Sarah in time. Glenn knew what he needed to do in this situation. He stopped, drew his sword, and battled them. One by one, they were defeated by him. Blood flowed in streams that could reach up to the ankles, and Sistin's white dress was partly dyed red at the bottom. She looked in horror at the frightening scene before her. When Glenn came to check on her, she pushed his hand away. In Sistin's eyes, even the familiar Glenn had now become frightening. At this moment, Leo appeared. Glenn knew the true identity of this person was actually Jadis. Seeing he couldn't hide anymore, he transformed back into his true form. Originally, he had intended to make Leo drink a potion to control him, but accidentally poured too much, causing the fool to die. Now the playground belonged to Glenn and Jadis, and it was time for Sistan to leave here, giving the stage to the two of them. It turned out that to meet Glenn and fight this battle with him, Jadis had calculated everything in the palm of his hand, manipulating Leo to arrange the duel, and even the wedding with Sistan. He had once been defeated by Glenn, but this time was different. Jadis was confident in possessing a Kazakh rears. His wish was to become a righteous sorcerer. In reality, just him dying would already be a form of justice. Jadis made the first move. The battle had begun. Meanwhile, Sistan lay flat on the ground, thinking about what had just happened. While Glenn had saved her, she had seen him as a villain, fearing he would push her further away. Sistan ran to the battlefield, just in time to save Glenn when he was in a disadvantageous situation. She had also torn off the blood-stained part of her dress. Sistan said a few words to Glenn, making him come to his senses and stand up once more, deciding to join forces with Sistan. Glenn also promised her that both of them would return safely together, and everyone gave each other the will to fight. Thanks to this, Glenn was able to beat Jadis to a pulp. Finally, they had driven him away, causing him to fly into the wall. Glenn turned to Sistan and saw she was exhausted from using too much magic. He had to go forward and carry her on his back. At the same time, Glenn's students also happily ran to the scene. Everyone had safely returned together, just as promised. Glenn drank with his colleagues, thinking about the magic that Jadis wanted to obtain. The next day, everything passed as usual. Glenn had become a serious teacher with a noble mission. After many battles, good had finally triumphed.